This is an interview with Mrs. Leonard Weiner, a prominent leader in the metropolitan Detroit community. Mrs. Weiner is the daughter of Milford Stern and Mollie Sillman Stern, who also were among the leaders in this community. In connection with the 75th anniversary celebration of the United Jewish Charities and the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Welfare Federation, a project has been undertaken to record the memories and experiences of a number of community leaders. This interview with Mrs. Weiner is being taped in her home in June of 1975. The interviewer is Mary Baroff.
Before we begin discussing your activities and community affairs, could you tell me just a little bit about yourself?
Gladly. You want to know when and where I was born?
Yes.
Age and everything. I was born in 1912 on East Grand Boulevard, about a block from the Belle Isle Bridge, and grew up on the east side. I attended the field school and the old Eastern High School, and then I had a brief semester at a finishing school in Washington called National Park Seminary, which was a lot of fun because I got to see Washington on official sightseeing trips, and all my dreams that I had dreamed all these years from reading boarding school books were turned into reality for that brief semester. And then I went out to the University of Michigan, where I was for 5 years because I stayed to get a master's in English literature. And my family, I have a brother. My parents, both gone now, were people who believed in doing their share for the community, and I think that set a kind of pattern for me. I remember that my mother was an officer of the local board of the Council of Jewish Women Detroit section. Seems to me she was once treasurer, and she had as much trouble balancing books as I do, but my father took care of it every month, so she was all ready to report to the board. My father was very much involved in the early days in the United Jewish Charities and the Jewish Welfare Federation. He was the second president of the Jewish Centers Association. And I suppose, trying to think back to my earliest memories of community service, he was once invited to address the Mothers Club at their annual Mothers and Daughters banquet. He said he'd be glad to do it, but he had a daughter and he thought he ought to bring her. That was me. I mean, it was I.
How old were you then?
I think I was about 8.
Uh-huh.
So I went to the banquet with my father, where he made a very nice speech. And they sat me next to him at the speaker's table, and they gave me a bouquet. And I think I've been working for that bouquet ever since. So I think the involvement of one's family can play a very important part. You don't necessarily do exactly what they did, but you have a sense of what was valuable to them, and it becomes part of you.
Were your parents born in this country?
Yes, my mother was a native Detroiter. She used to tell me about this town when she was a young girl, how it was really enclosed in the Grand Boulevard, east to west. And if you went for a ride out to Grosse Pointe on a Sunday, you had to pay a toll. You got past a certain place. She said that as a teenager, she went to visit some cousins in Kentucky, and they kidded her. Nobody ever heard of Detroit except for the Tigers. But of course, pretty soon along came the automobile industry, and things changed quite drastically. The city grew. I remember in school, even as a child, having a lot of interest in the various kinds of people I was with. The Detroit Free Press once ran a contest for children. They asked us to write poems or essays about the community chest. So of course I entered and I got published. I thought that was just great.
Of course.
And then there were scripts written for health shows and all kinds of things. And I always found a lot of fun and satisfaction out of participation in it.
Let me ask you this. Your parents became very involved in community activities. Did they have stimulation also in this area from their parents, or were?
I suppose so, though I don't really know. My mother's parents were gone long before I arrived on the scene. My father came from New York, and though I knew his parents briefly. I really don't know. I was very much impressed with the gentle sweetness of my grandmother, who used to come and visit us, my father's mother, in the summertime. I think she had had a very busy life raising her children and earning a living. Don't know how much time she had for outside activities, but she certainly had the kind of personality and wisdom that would have helped her, and all her children got themselves an education and went ahead and did things, so I think she did her job.
Could you tell me a little about your father?
Well, my father graduated from, I think it was City College of New York, where he was editor of the literary magazine as a young man. He was devoted to books and music. He taught himself to play the piano. He was a school teacher in New York when he married my mother. And then a business opportunity came to him through my uncle here in Detroit. I gathered a big decision had to be made whether to give up the security of the school job in New York to take a flyer in Detroit or not. But he decided to come, and he did come, and he went to law school at night. And they tell a story that he was taking his final exams the night I was being born. We had a telephone, which was sort of a special thing in those days. And he ran out after answering every question to find out what had happened to him. But my aunt was so busy calling everybody she knew that he never got the line. So he was a lawyer, and he used his training in business and in the family affairs, and I think it stood him in good stead in his work in the community, too. He was a very sweet and gentle person, I think, like his mother. And he had a great deal of ability as a speaker and as a person who brought varying groups together and helped them move along together.
You mentioned your memory of the occasion with the Mothers Club. Are there other memories that you have of the early Jewish community organization through your parents' activities?
Well, there were some very dramatic ones. My father was also very active in Temple Bethel, where he served as president at some point. I don't remember when exactly. And he was active in the Union for Progressive Judaism, the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And on 2 occasions, the whole family traveled to Europe to attend those meetings, once in London and once in Berlin just shortly before the Nazis took over. And I do remember that experience because the Jewish people we met in Berlin were very worried, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them. And I remember speaking with a group of youngsters, I was a young teenager then, about my age, who talked about this, and then I made a little speech in English which they translated into German. There were many associations of that kind, and it was a natural part of my life.
Mm-hmm. So that actually I don't really have to ask you why you became involved in community affairs. You really came by it quite naturally, but in what did you first become involved?
I think the first formal thing I can remember was working as a volunteer one summer during my college days at the Jewish Community Center on Melbourne Street. I was advisor to a group of boys and girls who were putting out a magazine. And I think I went there one day a week, and I enjoyed it very much. And there were various people who thought I'd make a great social worker, but somehow I never saw myself in that role.
That wasn't the direction you wanted to take.
No. Though I spent a lot of time in it without having done the academic preparation.
What else was among your early
well, then, one thing always leads to the next. I was out at school in Ann Arbor, and people make fun of sororities too often, I think. I think I had a lot of living experience as a sorority girl, and I became involved in the management of the sorority and was the dean of the chapter. And I learned a lot about how people can get along or not get along under those circumstances. As soon as I came back to Detroit, the finger was put upon me by the Detroit section of the National Council of Jewish Women. Regine Freund-Cohen was then the section president. a very wonderful woman with great ability, lawyer, woman of great heart. And she was interested in starting a junior group in the Council of Jewish Women. Not children, but young women from about 18 to 30. In those days, there were many girls that age who were at home. Not as many went off to school far away as they do now. And it seemed a good group to reach out to for the future of council. And so I became the organizing chairman of a junior group which had about 125 young women in it, and which lasted for several years until the scene in the community changed somewhat and there were fewer such people available for that kind of activity. But we have had many leaders in council and in the community who started their community careers in the junior group of the Detroit section.
What were some of the activities that you related yourself to in the junior group?
Well, we followed along the national programs of service to the aged, service to children. We helped raise money through the thrift shops, which council ran then and still runs as its major fundraising effort locally. We had discussion groups and book reviews and charm courses and occasional meetings with the seniors, which were a chance for programming and for knowing what the issues of the day were. This was in the 30s. We were concerned with the Jewish problems all over the world, and we learned a great deal about that as young women we might not have known about without this kind of stimulation.
What, as a matter of fact, one of the questions that I would like to ask you is, what were some of the major problems with which the community was faced at that time?
Well, you know, the lights were going out all over Europe, to use a cliche, and it was obvious people didn't know quite what to do about it. There were people bringing relatives to this country as fast as they could and finding places for them. There was the beginning of the service of the agency that helps these people settle in.
Resettlement service.
The resettlement service in Detroit, and council was very much a part of that, meeting the trains when they came in from Windsor, and airplanes, and helping families find living quarters, and giving specialized English classes to a mother so she'd know how to take her child to the doctor and say where it hurts, or to a man who had to fill out an application form as long as his arm for hoping for a job in one of our factories. We were all very much involved in those things.
That was probably also a period of a great deal of economic stress in the community.
Well, we were just coming out of the Depression. We went from the Depression to the war, and it was in the middle. When the Second World War came, I was president of the Detroit section. I was in the junior group until I was married, which was a matter of a couple of years. Then I became a senior, a regular member of the section. And because fools rush in where angels fear to tread, I soon found myself as a very young president of the Detroit section. And we were faced then with all the problems that afflicted any group in wartime. We got very busy with activities to support the war effort, selling bonds, recruiting people for first aid and air raid wardens, and helping with the coupon distribution and all the other things that went on. We also had a problem about how can you have meetings when nobody has gasoline. And it seemed to me then, I remember a newspaper article where we were all quoted, that might be just as well if people had to think carefully before they held a meeting.
Yeah.
That the fewer the better, and we would have better ones, and it worked that way.
Is that right?
Yes, it did.
We'll probably be discussing council much more thoroughly later. I just wanted to discuss the early period of your activities. I would like to now go into a discussion of your organizational activities. Could we start with the Jewish Community Center? Could you tell me when and how you became involved?
Well, I have to go back to the Council of Jewish Women again, because in my life it has been a sort of second family. And what's happened to me there, I think has happened to many women who were taken by the concepts in council. as soon as you become active, you get thrust into the community in one place or another, because it's a looking outward kind of organization. When I was president of the Detroit section, a group of women who lived in the 12th Street area came to see us, the council. They'd already been to see the center and had a sympathetic hearing. They said they needed a branch of the community center in their neighborhood because it was a neighborhood which was being abandoned by everybody who could leave. And those who were left were the very old and the very young and the very poor. And all the synagogues and everybody else was leaving 12th Street and going north. We took this seriously, as did the center. And the center felt that they couldn't do this job alone. So we talked to them about doing it cooperatively. And it took a great deal of talk and a great deal of planning, because it had not been the custom, if it had ever happened, for a professional agency to be partners with a voluntary agency in this sense before. But together we worked out a plan whereby the center paid the basic rent and so forth for a storefront, and we provided enough money for salary for an executive and volunteers to do almost anything you can imagine, and we did open a branch of the Jewish Community Center called the 12th Street Council Center. And it went on there for about 7 years. Did a great program in services to the aged and a great deal of work for very young children.
What were some of the things that were done?
Well, when we first had the conception of a program for old people in the neighborhood, we found out very soon that you couldn't just announce a program and expect anybody to come. One of the leaders in those days, who became a very important woman in programs for the aged, was Sadie Geshlin, who now lives in Florida. Sadie and I keep in touch because I've never gotten over what a wonderful lady she is. She decided that her committee would just go knock on doors and tell the older people in the 12th Street area that we had things going on at that little center where they might enjoy themselves. And she said that at first her committee was met with great suspicion. By the people they went to see. People would say, "What do you want from me? Why are you bothering me? What's it going to cost?" But eventually they came over, and all kinds of things happened. I remember we had a couple of ladies, and they were very handsome women, as it happened, who took on the job of writing letters, because many of these old folks couldn't write in English and they needed letters written for them. There were recreational groups, dancing and singing and cooking, and pretty soon we found that we had a Golden Age Club going, it's what you'd call it now. And the movement was beginning other places, because I've noticed, and I'm sure everybody knows, that as soon as somebody gets a bright idea, that same idea is being born somewhere else, because it's meeting the need of a time. And our Golden Age group was then inviting Golden Age groups from churches and synagogues and all kinds of labor unions too, I believe, all kinds of people for various events. I remember going to one such party. I think it was a Catholic Golden Age group that was visiting with us. And we were upstairs in the biggest room in the center, a little worried that the ceiling might fall down, because there was a fiddler and he was playing folk dance music, and people were demonstrating the folk dances they knew, and they soon recognized that folk dances are very similar, whether they come from Russia or from Poland or from Scotland. They're almost the same, and people were beginning to dance together. There was some wine on the bar or on the table. And I heard one of the old gentlemen say to one of our gentlemen, "Is this kosher wine?" And our friend looked back at him and said, "Well, it won't be when you drink it." So all in all, a great deal of fun and help was given there. And then, of course, we acted as a referral source if people needed some kind of help that we couldn't give. We didn't know where they could be sent or taken. We served that kind of purpose.
Did the council people serve as volunteers in the center?
And all kinds of
and work
jobs.
With the professionals?
Yes, all kinds of jobs. They were carefully trained, and whenever we had somebody with special skill, like somebody who would teach piano or knitting or cooking or what, if we had enough people interested in this activity, we'd have it once a week or twice a week. It was a sort of a grassroots community center kind of program.
It sounds almost whatever you know of settlement houses. It
really
had the
was,
same quality.
yes,
of,
it was very much like the old-fashioned settlement house. But that's what was needed there. The trick in all these things, I think, is to not to be bound by rigid rules laid down in somebody's book, but to find out what will be useful and helpful and constructive for the people who are there.
What were some of the activities that you remember that were evolved for children?
Well, we had a sort of a play group. It wasn't really a nursery center, but it was a play group for children, and mothers could leave their children there for an hour or two and go shopping and go to the doctor, do things that they otherwise were unable to do when they were having a home alone. We had some pool tables and ping pong for the teenagers as a way of giving them a constructive place to be after school instead of wandering around on the streets. I can't remember the detail, but I know that at the height of the 12th Street Center, we had about 100 to 125 volunteers a week in there.
Is that right?
And it really was a great activity. So from that, it was natural for the center to invite me on the board, and I became a board member.
When about was that?
Oh, I suppose around 1945. I don't know exactly.
Was there anything unique that you remember about the needs in the community or the services that the center was called upon to provide at that time?
I think that was the time when, about the time when the Jewish Parents Institute was beginning to be developed. We had a Sunday fun program trying to have something valuable for members and their families of all ages in the center. There was a great deal of USO and wartime days, parties of all kinds. I don't remember details of that either, but I know we were very busy. We were trying to make the center what I think it has become, a meeting place for a vast majority of the Jewish community in Detroit. Outside of all the bounds and strictures, people of all kinds to come there for stimulation, for interest, for friendship.
I see. Let me ask you this: who were some of the people that you recall that provided the lay and professional leadership during the time of your association?
Hy Broder was president at some point during my activity there, and Mrs. Samuel Grobauer and Gertrude Grobauer, who I also knew from the National Board of the Council of Jewish Women, very fine people. Herman Jacobs was the director. I learned a great deal from him because he too was a very sensitive kind of social worker. I used to kid him about the long words he used, and once wrote him a letter of words in one syllable, and he got the point. But that was my confusion, not his.
This was really when the center was, the main office was on Woodward and
yes.
Holbrook.
That's right.
I see. Anything else that you remember about the center, your activities with it?
Well, it was a meeting place. Many of the Federation Women's Division meetings were held there. Many council meetings were held there. We felt very much at home there. The council office moved in that building for a while. Didn't have much space, but it was a nice place to be. I don't know what else I can tell you.
Okay, let's talk a little about your association then with the Jewish Community Council. Again, when and how did you become involved?
Well, it was in the early days. Isaac Frank was the director, and Aaron Druck was one of the leaders. The Jewish Community Council, in the beginning, seemed to embrace all the groups that weren't particularly important in the Federation. And it was a sort of a point of pride to get them together too and to give them some clout. Of course, those days are long gone and everybody is together now. But we were developing a unified community, and I think the council helped that.
Groups came in as groups into the council.
Yes, yes. And they were very much interested in the defense work and community relations work, building relationships with the labor unions, with other religious groups, so that the Jewish story would get a fair shake.
How do you recall how the council conveyed its interests or whatever to Federation, to the planning bodies?
Well, there was a lot of duplicate membership.
Mhm.
I remember at one point Julian Crowley, who was certainly a leader in the Federation, was also a leader in the community council. Nobody was walled off, but it seemed to be a place where the people of less length of rootedness in the community, or perhaps less affluence in the community, got started in community affairs. Now, I could be wrong, but that was my impression.
So that it actually gave a voice to
many
groups that
Mhm.
that previously did not have a voice with the official
Or at least
community.
didn't feel that they
Didn't-
had it.
right,
They
right.
might have had it, but they weren't sure that they had it.
Right. Is that the major role that you feel played at the time that...
Well, I think that's how it all began, but I think now it's certainly much more sophisticated. And the council and the federation, the council's one of the agencies of the federation, and its relationship is, without any question, very strong, and it takes on the community relations job, the formal community relations job. I believe that the federation does community relations every day of the week, but the formal organized ones are the responsible, as I understand.
Do you remember what some of the problems that the council faced during this period were?
Well, there was a lot of talk about shall we be friendly with the Russians or not, because they're fighting the Germans. There was all this problem with that kind of thing. And what position Jews ought to take was argued out hours on end. There were the Yiddishists and the Hebraists and the Englishists who were all saying that the community council should be only in one language or another. And I remember one time somebody made a speech in Yiddish, and one of the people who felt English should be the language took very careful count of all the English words used in that Yiddish speech.
And I bet there were hundreds.
There were a lot,
Yeah.
I don't really remember the horny problems. I think it was mostly a matter of getting everybody into the act of the community. And I'm glad we did it, because that's what made Detroit such a good community.
What was your involvement with the council?
Well, I became a member of the board, and I tried to do whatever they asked me to do. I made speeches here and there. I remember presiding once at an assembly, and I was just fine as far as the formal speeches were concerned. But when they started in on the discussions were coming in Yiddish and in English, and I didn't know who was saying what for whom, and I was standing there and smiling. Somebody had to come and bail me out, and they did.
Yeah, Golda Krolik mentioned the same thing, that her husband used to say that it was so difficult for him to understand the language.
I get every 10th word, but I couldn't really understand these quick back and forth repartee
Yeah.
statements. Another person I remember from those days is Dr. Schmeier Kleinman, who I saw just a few months ago as hale and hearty as ever. He was a very devoted member of the council, and I think is still on the board. He was interested in all the problems they had, and he never lost his verve. So it's a delight to meet him again as time goes by.
Yes. Now could we talk about the women's division, where you have been so active for such a long time? Again, how and when did you become active?
I don't know whether I was on the first board of the women's division or not. I know that a group of women under the leadership of our wonderful Dory Ehrlich sat together and decided in those days, when was it, about 1945, 46?
Yes, I think so.
That it was time for the women of Detroit to organize themselves for the benefit of Jews all over the world. Women had always been part of our community fundraisings, and there was a committee that worked with the United Jewish Charities and in the early days of the Federation. But in these days of the beginning of the women's division, the theory was that every woman had a right to participate in the life-saving tasks of the Welfare Federation, both at home and abroad. and that we had to provide that opportunity, and that this meant some kind of formal organization to which a woman could belong by giving of her own ability and her own resources to the work of the Federation. And a women's division was formed with Mrs. Ehrlich as the first president and as a continuing source of inspiration, I think, to every woman in the community. She was followed by Clara Frank, and I was the third president of the women's division. In the early days, there was much discussion about what kind of an organization this ought to be. There were some people who felt that if we organized a committee which would work to raise money from women at campaign time, that would be sufficient. There were others who thought that that would be a very thin way of operating because we would have no opportunity to educate and to train, and that debate took quite a while, and it was finally decided that it should be a year-round operation with some educational facets to it so that the community would get to know what the causes were, and if you know, you're always moved to do your best.
So that, in other words, right from the beginning, the whole concept of this being an educational and training source was part of.
I think it began very soon after the first organization, because I remember, I don't know the year, I wish I were better with dates, but I remember what I think was the first institute. You know, like we used to call them the January Institute, and then they moved the January Institute to November, so now it's just Institute. And that was a big open meeting that was held at the Statler in those days downtown, where all the women in the community were invited to learn about the causes served by the Federation, with the hope that learning about them would mean that they would want to support them. And we've gone on having had an institute every year since, as far as I know, but we've gone much beyond that in our education programs, trying to devise training at various levels for leadership, for young women new to the community, for strangers who never heard of the Federation and not to have the story told in somebody's living room. And the education program has been very helpful. There were some people who felt that a year-round program would detract from the other organizations in the community. And I think there is a reason to be sure that the Women's Division does its own business and not everybody else's. But so far they've been pretty good at that. There were other people who felt that with the organization of a Women's Division, all the other women's groups should disappear. And I think that would have been a terrible thing, because the other organizations can do special pieces of work. Once the family, which is the Federation, lays the groundwork, then they can come in and do special things. And also, they can develop the leadership that the Federation needs and keeps getting fed to it by these other groups. I think we've had a wonderful women's division. It's open to any woman who makes her own pledge.
As an individual.
As an individual. Now, you know, in the early days, there was some difficulty in explaining this to some people who would say, and from one point of view, with great logic, my husband earns the money and he makes the gift, and that's it for both of us. But Dora had a good answer for that. She said there isn't any woman here who doesn't have some freedom with her household money, at least. And there are many women who have much freedom of personal income. And if they want to, they can do something about it. And if they feel that they can cry their own tears and feel their own heartbeat and have their own sense of sympathy, then they will do something about it. And on that basis, I think we finally got across the message that women have to express themselves at whatever is their own best level. And our job as the Women's Division was to help them reach that best level and to keep at it. And we've been at it all these years since 1946.
In the beginning, were there considerations as to whether the group of people should come in as individuals or as groups?
Well, many women's divisions, ours is one of the first that organized as a year-round, but many of them which did organize in other cities were sort of organization of organizations. Never went for that. We felt that it should be an individual matter, and I think this avoided a great deal of rivalry and one organization trying to be more important than another. People came in there on their own. The organizations helped us. We accepted treasury gifts and still do, but they are usually token gifts, which simply say to the members of that organization, we believe in the Federation, we want you to do your part, and so we make a token gift to get you started. And we find that the Women's Division has introduced women from one part of the community to another and made them friends and co-workers. It has built all the organizations. Because if you work with somebody from another entirely different facet of the community that you never knew before, and you love her and respect her and believe in her, then you're likely to go along with her and her organization too, and she and yours. And I think we've all gained from it.
So that, in other words, one of the unique contributions really that the Women's Division has made is a unifying kind of force within the community.
I think so.
Yes, are there any other unique contributions that the Women's
very
Division has
unique is
made?
the amount of money that's been raised
true.
from women. Because women, I think, we were liberated. I used to say of council, it was the Women's Lab for Women's Lib. I think the Women's Division liberated women too, because as Dora said, you think for yourself, you feel for yourself, and you express yourself at whatever level you can afford. So I think it did a great deal to raise our consciousness as women.
And actually, the fundraising itself has been a sizable amount each year, has
Oh
it
yes,
not?
it's tremendous.
Mhm.
It's really wonderful. I wish I were better with figures. I heard the figure at the last meeting and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm afraid to.
I think Mrs. Broder said that the goal has always been 10% of the general goal. Is
Well,
that correct?
that's in general terms, but we've gone beyond that.
Is that
many
right?
times.
Uh-huh.
12%, I remember one year.
Uh-huh.
And this year it was a tremendous amount of money. I don't remember. I wish I did, and we ought to look it up and put it in this tape somewhere.
Okay. What has been your personal involvement in Women's Division?
Well, I started out with the education department. Somehow it always seems to fall to me to be an interpreter, which I like to try to do, not always successfully. But I worked in the programs for the first institutes, and I don't remember the whole progression. All of a sudden I found I was president of the Women's Division, and again, I was a very young woman for that kind of job, but I had the great joy of working with Pauline Jackson, who was our executive director. And I learned many things from Pauline. I think one of the main things she taught me was if I ever had a good impulse, just to act on it. Don't wait, don't hold back, just do it.
As Theodore Reich would say, listening with the third ear, right?
I guess. And she was well organized. She had a great belief in the cause we were trying to serve, and together I think we had a very good time. It was during those years that we dreamed up the communities, though we were more antiseptic in those days. We called them community clinics. I remember sitting with Pauline one day, and she was saying, we have these wonderful meetings, but the people who ought to come don't come. I said, well, then we have to take the information out to them, and that was the beginning of communities. In those days, we...
Is that where you meet at people's homes
yes,
to interpret?
Yes. Mm-hmm. A hostess invites friends or neighbors, or new people that she's heard of in the community, and our women go out and tell the story. It's not a direct fundraising meeting, it's a meeting of education and involvement. What's I going to say? Those days we had many activities which I suppose the city is too old and sophisticated and big now to go for. But I remember one fundraising meeting at some hotel downtown where all the women of every range of giving met together, and then they picked their own room with a label on it, from $100 to $500, from $50 to $100, from $500 to $1,000 to go into to make their pledges. We had a very good time out of our work. I think that was perhaps it's too late for that now. Life got too serious and people got too involved. But we tried to build a great deal of friendship. We had fun. Many of our meetings had skits and songs, and I was very much involved in doing those. In fact, I used to kid about how the Federation really should pay for one ticket to the best musical show each year, because every year when I went to New York for a council board meeting or the National Board of the United Jewish Appeal Women's Division, I would be sure to go to see the most famous musical, and then that became fodder for the next annual meeting. One of the favorite shows was really suggested to us by Leonard N. He said, why don't we call it Gifts and Dolls? And of course that was the year of Guys and Dolls, and it was just wonderful to write a song about if I were a chick, I'd be stretching. And we had all the songs from that show, and that usually was the way we did our annual meetings.
Who were some of your other co-producers?
Jerry Gross did a great many of these shows. Flossie Krieger was a partner and scriptwriter for many. There were a lot of people involved. Again, I wish I had all the names. And if I went through all those papers, I'd find them.
Does someone have all of these skits that were done? Do you?
I have many. I have many of the songs. Yes, I gave them all to Esther Jones before this last meeting in case she wanted to use them. I think she's given them back to me, but they're still around.
It would seem to me that would be great to have in the archives, because it would also, in addition to the fun of it, would probably give some picture of some of the things that were dealt with at a particular time.
Well, Jenny Jones had a favorite song, The Young at Heart, so that turned into The Generous Heart. Whatever anybody said, I like this song, I say, okay. And we'd make
it. It went.
And it went, and then we dreamed up a few of our own.
That's great. You mentioned some of the people who made important contributions to the women's division. Dora Ehrlich, of course. Could you tell me a little about Dora Ehrlich?
Well, I knew Dora all my life. She was the kind of person who would say to me and to almost everybody else in town, I knew you before you were born. And she had a tremendous memory, which I don't have, it's obvious already. She could look at someone and tell them about their mother and their father and their aunts and cousins, and they reckoned up by dozens. She knew all the relationships. She had been active, I think, in every good cause that was developed in this city for her whole lifetime. And she was sort of the grande dame of the community, and I think a wonderful person, because she crossed all these lines, and she did it with so much love and feeling.
I never knew her, but that's true that everyone mentions Dora Ehrlich.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Golda Krolik is another favorite lady of mine. Golda taught me something interesting for me, which I might have been smart enough to learn for myself, but I had to see her do it. When she was involved in participating in a meeting, she just relaxed and was Golda. If she felt like telling a joke and it was appropriate, she told it. She didn't sit there with big words pouring out of her mouth. She just let herself go. And I watched that, and I thought, my, that's what makes her so able to reach people. So I tried to copy that style.
You've done all right. Is there anyone else among the leadership that you can tell me about?
Well, there are many wonderful women in this town. I think of Mildred Welch, who was a past national president of the National Council of Jewish Women, and has always had a very incisive mind, very analytical skill, who served the women's division. I think she was chairman of visiting nurses in the neighborhood service organization. Somehow these people are getting going, they never stop, because as I find myself, one thing always leads you to 10 others, and the problem is, how are you going to encompass them all? But they're so exciting and so interesting that you lead a very happy life.
And also, not only in the Jewish community, but so many of these people have really taken a very active role in other in the general community affairs also.
Well, I don't see how you can stop. I've had this discussion from both ends with the people who say, there are some here, all your time should be devoted to the Jewish community, or the people who say all your time should be devoted to the general community. And I say, well, I am who I am. I'm an American Jewish woman, and all of these are part of me, and I can't pigeonhole myself here or there. I have to be myself everywhere. And so wherever there's something, which I get called on to do, if they can tell me whether it's true or not, that I have a contribution to make. Not if they say it won't take any time.
Yeah,
if they say there's something we need you for that you can do particularly, I want to do it. And I keep trying.
Well, there are many people in the community like this, so that we're very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
I think that's true.
Yeah. We are now continuing with side 2 of the taping with Josephine Weiner. Mrs. Weiner, when did you become a board member of Federation? Approximately.
I think I served on the board of the Federation when I was the Women's Division president. And it was an interesting experience. One of the memories I have is that a big problem at that time was borrowing money. I think it was the first time that the United Jewish Appeal asked us to borrow money so that cash would be available for the overseas needs. And it was a question whether one should borrow or one should not borrow.
In other words, from bank or...
From banks, yes,
I see.
on the credit of the community. And I remember it was either the board or the executive committee, the chairman going around asking each person what he felt about this. And I am not a business person, and as I said to them very frankly, I'm a housewife, and anything over $100 kind of scares me, but I know that if I had a sick child, I would borrow or beg or do whatever was necessary to heal that child. So I think we ought to borrow. And I guess that was a satisfactory answer from my point of view. It was done, and it's been done many times since, and the community has always come through and made it good, and so it's legitimate.
So that there were strong overseas concerns at the time.
Yes.
What were some of the other problems that were dealt with?
There was the difficulty of keeping the local community strong at the same time that these overseas needs were so great. And again, Dora Ehrlich had a very good answer, in that if we didn't have a strong local community, there would be nobody in the future to take care of overseas needs. And so that the best all people could do would be to do their best for the total campaign, and then everybody would grow, and the needs of all community would be met, and that was the basis on which we went ahead. I think those were the early days of the budget conferences, when people were called together to hear the story from all the divisions of the Federation, from the national organizations and the UJA and the Joint Distribution Appeal, and then to make some kind of percentage decision about how the funds raised were to be expended. I think that was a very fine exercise, because the community had a chance then to express itself, and those who were doubtful that their particular baby was going to get enough began to see the total picture. I think that was an important thing the Federation did.
In other words, the question of how distribution would be resolved really had input from the various people, the various agencies, and so on.
And from individuals who were interested. Yes, from all the board members of all agencies were invited to those meetings. Of course, the board of the Federation, the Women's Division, and all its agencies. And they sat together, those who represented national organizations too. And they began to see the total, because it's very easy when you are deeply involved in any one good cause, and there are millions of good causes, to see that only with a bright light on it and everything else in the dim background. And here the light was turned on the whole thing, and you began to see the important thing was to explain the story to everybody, to get the best possible gift from everybody, so that everybody could have the light where they needed it.
What did you have any specific jobs while you were on the board at Federation?
I served on one of the budget committees. I think it was the education, helping to make the decision on which agencies got what.
I see. Who provided the leadership, both lay and professional, during your term of office with the board?
I mean, who was president of the Federation?
Okay.
I don't really remember. Isn't that awful? There are a lot of good men and true, but I don't remember which one. I was always impressed through the years with High Broder. I don't think he was still here in those days when I was on. I don't know if he was or not before. Sam Rubiner, who was president of UCS when I served in there for a long time. There were many men. I can't remember. Very fine people.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to talk with you about one of the real loves in your life, and that is the Council of Jewish Women, right?
Oh, that's easy.
Okay. When did you say you left the junior division of the council to become involved?
When I was married, the junior division was not a separate thing from the Detroit section. It was a group in the Detroit section of young women who met when it was convenient for them, like Sunday afternoons, evenings, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
When I was married, I became more active in the total section. And I remember my first job was as assistant to the public relations chairman. I had a little baby by that time, and I wasn't free to run around town. But I was free to telephone anybody. And I was either given or took for myself the job of writing one story a week about some phase of council activity and sending it to all the Detroit papers and the Jewish News. Whether they printed it or not was not my worry. I had to see that it got in. And that way I learned a great deal about what the section was doing, and I did tell the story as many places as I possibly could. And then shortly thereafter I became a vice president of the section. And then something happened, the president got sick, and the other vice president became the president, and you know how it goes.
Yes.
I went on from there.
What have been some of the unique contributions of the council to our local community life?
Well, if you're talking about specific institutions and programs, some of the current ones are really very exciting. There's the Orchards, which is a residential, started out only as a residential home for mostly disturbed boys. And there is still that facet to it. We have a house in Livonia where 9 young men at a time can be housed. They are youngsters who have sort of not made it at home, not made it in school, for whom the community needs a special setting as a chance to give them a way to work themselves back into society. And they live at the house where it's 24-hour care, really, but they go to the public schools, which is one of the most collaborative. And we've had many success stories. The boys stay a year or two, and many of them have gone on to college. We had one who was a candidate for Rhodes Scholarship a couple of years ago.
Is that so?
I don't think any of them have failed to make a decent life after coming out of the Orchards. But the Orchards program has proliferated beyond that into summer camping in conjunction with Camp Tamarack for a period when mostly disturbed youngsters are served. And this is used not only to give those kids a good time, but it's a chance for the social workers to understand their problems better and to keep the connection with them over the summer and go on throughout the year. The Orchards also has an outreach program for boys and girls who don't have to live in a residential center but who need some kind of specialized activity after school and so on, and hundreds of families reach that way. There's always been family counseling along with the service to the children in the home. So that I think it's made a real contribution. The city had nothing like that for years.
How is the Orchards funded?
The deficit funding, buying the property, and all the special things are done by council. And then the children are referrals from one agency or another, and they are paid for by the referring agency. Mm-hmm. So it sometimes can be a government agency or a private agency.
I see. What are some of the other contributions that council has made?
Well, you can go back before my time. One of the projects that always interested me, and it's such a good example of council philosophy, was the penny lunch program. This is a long time ago, before I was grown up. Maybe, I don't even know when, maybe before I was even around. the Council of Women in Detroit realized that children couldn't learn on an empty stomach. And that's brand new news coming out of studies on hunger nowadays, but they knew it in those days. And so they set up a program in one school in Detroit, and I don't even know the name of the school. They went down and they cooked one hot meal a day for the kids in that school. And they didn't want it to be charity, so they charged a penny, so that the children would feel that they were paying their way. And this was the forerunner of the school lunch program. And I think, that's the kind of activity the council does. The philosophy has always been from 1893 when we were organized, that in our local communities and nationally, we look for unmet needs and demonstrate if we can how to meet them, and then hope that the bigger community will take them on, and we go out and look for something else. Detroit section right now is very deeply involved in the Meals on Wheels program, which is done cooperatively with the Jewish Children and Family Service and Federation of Partners, where they are now serving about 50 homebound elderly men and women. Volunteers packing lunches which are dietetically proper and which are prepared under the supervision of the chef at the Federation of Partners, and are carried 5 days a week to the homes of the homebound. One hot meal and one cold meal in the basket. The women go in teams, and some men have joined them, and some men are joining council because of their interest in this program.
Is that right?
And they also act as sort of friendly visitors and troubleshooters because they go in with the food, they talk to the people, they establish a friendly relationship. They are in position to report back to Family and Children's Service if there's a problem there that they feel needs some professional attention. And this started as an experiment with 20 families about 2.5 or 3 years ago, and is now up to 50. The women are eager to extend the program or to find other people to extend it because they know it's needed all over the city.
Tremendous need.
Yes.
Tremendous.
Their own group is largely Jewish, and many of the meals have to be especially arranged for diabetics and so on, but all of that is done. It's done with great love and great care. And there are programs of all kinds all over the place in the council. I know that any morning when I wake up, in the National Council of Jewish Women throughout the United States, where we have 100,000 members and sections all over, there are well over 1,000 community service programs going on in the council direction. And this is a lovely thing to know. They go from small things to big things. There are council sections which have built and maintained with federal grants homes for the aged. There are sections that have Boy and Girl Scout troops for mentally retarded children. I remember going to Tulsa as another example of how council works. I went to visit their Tulsa section once some years ago, and they took me to see a program that they were doing. They had a bus, and I'm trying to remember what it was called, the Green Hornet or the Green Snake. It had a insignia painted on it. It was a bus which some gentleman in the community had donated to them, which they had refurbished so that instead of steps it had a ramp. It could receive wheelchairs and people on crutches. And this bus went all over town 5 days a week in those days and picked up the closet cases who hadn't been out of their homes for years and took them to an old warehouse which was turned into a recreational center. And I saw people playing shuffleboard from their wheelchairs. I saw people doing arts and crafts from their wheelchairs, all kinds of things. And then I went back a few years later, and lo and behold, council took me to see their rehabilitation program, which was now part of the community organization like the United Community Services here, in a beautiful building, especially designed, and not just one bus, and not just 5 days a week, but 7 days and 6 nights, and several buses, and no longer a council project per se, but with the council volunteers still very actively involved. Whatever the need is, that's what the section is.
That's where you're there to
and it's
try to
really
meet.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. And then nationally, we try to parallel this with programs overseas for the sake of our fellow Jews. And in Israel since '46, we've had various programs in education. In the early days, we were the ones who enabled Israel to have its first teacher training program for high school teachers at the Hubert University, which later developed into a school of education, which didn't need our support for that anymore, so our money went into special research programs. And from that, we finally evolved into an institution which is now well established in Israel, about 5 years old, called the NCJW, National Council of Jewish Women Institute for Innovations in Education. And it is the central research institute for meeting the educational needs of disadvantaged people in Israel. Does all kinds of programs with the blessing and sometimes with the request, at the request of the Ministry of Education, tries things out. If they're any good, they become part of the school system right away. It doesn't take 30 years. We have many visiting professors from the United States coming to do research at our institute, and many of our people come here to lecture. I know they've been in Lansing. I've gone out to have lunch with our fellows in Lansing and at the University of Michigan. And there is an exchange, so that whatever we learn there will be of value to us in this country, too.
That's very exciting.
It's really wonderful.
Let me ask you this. What has been the relationship between the Council of Jewish Women and Federation and Federation agencies? They're both provide services to the community.
Well, they both provide service to the community, and I think they're sort of complementary. Council began before there were any federations. It is the oldest of the organized Jewish women's groups in this country. And I told you the philosophy. The early motto was faith and humanity. And you can interpret that any way you want. But in the early days, it was interpreted as meaning faith, Judaism, and its perpetuation and safety. And humanity was all people, where we have to live. Federations have come along and have put together the various good causes that were started by volunteers in the country, so that there could be efficiency and planning and budgeting and forethought and understanding and wider outreach for all of these agencies. The Council continues to be innovative, to look for the unmet needs, very often demonstrates to a community and the Federation takes over. Sometimes it's a partnership, sometimes it's something which Council gives up and goes on to other things. I think that Council's not the only agency that does important things in the community. There are many. And I think all of them need the overall agencies, like the United Community Services, like the Federation, to form the basic bulwark of support to meet human needs, like the federal programs. But you can't just stop there. You have to have a chance for special ideas, for special feelings, for a grassroots movement. And the Council and other organizations are that. So I don't think there's any competition. I think they simply help one another. Without the basic organizations, the Council programs wouldn't mean very much. But without the Council programs, the basic organizations wouldn't advance very far.
Has Council provided any leadership to Federation? By that I mean people.
Well, of course. Well, I'm one example.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not the only one. We have a marvelous young woman, I'm just thinking, on our board now from Atlanta, who is the director of the Women's Division of the Atlanta Federation. We had another lovely young woman. When I was the National Council president, I asked her to take an important job in Council. And she had been on the board with me. She's from St. Augustine. No. The names are terrible. Down in Texas, way down there by the Mexican border. Anyway.
San Antonio.
San Antonio. So I wrote to my friend in San Antonio, and she wrote back and she said, I'd love to do it, Joe, but I've just become director of our women's division. Now this goes on all the time. I think one of the special things that Council does is to train women so that many of them are ready for professional careers. And if they're not ready for professional careers, they become presidents of everything in sight. And I think it's wonderful, and I think it's a contribution to
it's a fantastic service.
The American Jewish community that very few people pay much attention to. But if you look in any city, or look at the bios of any of the Council national leadership, you'll see they've done all kinds of things in their temples, in their religious schools, in the Hebrew schools, in the PTAs, in the synagogues, anywhere you look, they've been. The Mayor's Youth Committee, the justice programs, the courts, they're everywhere, and they got trained by council. My own experience has been that I can always go back to council and get refurbished and all new excitement sent out again, and that's been the story of the lives of many of us.
One other question. What are some of the services that have been adopted by Federation agencies that Council initiated? Are there any?
Well, I think the service to the aging, which really began in our 12th Street Center, is a very simple example, but that's one which has certainly gone far beyond what we did. But it really began there. It led eventually to a city committee on the aging and the mayor's commission and now a state commission on the aging. And I don't say we were the only group that did it, but we were in there at the beginning. If you go back into the congressional record, you'll find that Head Start, there are speeches in the record which credit Council of Jewish Women in New York City for being the first ones to point toward a Head Start program.
Is that right?
Yes, and this sort of thing goes on all the time. We did nationally a daycare study a few years ago, which only a national organization could do. It was not a scientifically statistical study in the sense that statistic experts would do it. But what we did was we formulated questionnaires under professional direction. And Mary Dublin Kaiserman was the director of the study. She's one of our members. And we asked our sections, and I think 96 of them took it on, to take a look at the daycare services in their own community, to report it, this questionnaire. And then we put all those 96 studies together, and we got what we called Windows on Daycare, which was a frank look at what the communities had to offer, big and small, all across the country. It's been used as a basic text by all kinds of organizations in the daycare field. We are now involved in a similar study in Justice for Children, which has a great deal to do. It's a timely one with the whole, in Michigan, for instance, the rewriting of the juvenile code, the new national legislation having to do with children. And this kind of information is one of the big things that we do.
I'm sure you've had your fingers in many of the council pies, but are there any specific jobs that you have had that you can tell me about?
Well, my first job on the national board when I was elected in 1953 was to serve as chairman of the National Public Relations Committee. So there I was again trying to tell a council story to our various publics, the internal public of our own organization, the general community, the Jewish community. And I've always found that that's a fascinating thing. It's not an organization, council is not an organization that you can interpret in 3 words. I had friends that say to me, I know you do good, but what do you do? And to try to say it on one foot, you should be able to if you can tell about all of Judaism on one foot. But it is a many-faceted organization, and it has a constant philosophy of service to faith and humanity, but the programs change as the needs change. So that was always fascinating to me. And then I became an assistant recording secretary, which I thought was a pretty miserable kind of job until I really got started at it. I learned that serving as secretary of something is a wonderful way to understand the organization, because in order to write decent minutes, you have to not only hear what's actually said, but you have to know what's underneath it, and you have to be able to put enough of that in to make your minutes coherent. So a couple of years of that was great training. And then I became a vice president. In council we have 5 of those, so it isn't such a great honor, it's just a lot of work. And then you serve as the president's helper, whatever you can do. If something new is being developed in the organization, you may have the job of developing it. I became a great traveler for council. I went all over the country, visited council sections everywhere. I remember one trip when in 11 days I visited 9 sections with a different job to do in each one. And I found that this was a wonderful experience for me. I'm a sightseer by nature, and I felt at home everywhere I went because the faces were different. The motivation of the women and their sense of values was the same every place, and I felt right at home. I did a great deal of that. I also got very much involved with our work in Israel, and I was very happy to have a part in the development of this new research center, the Research Institute now. It was a center until it became a permanently established institute in the university. And I have enjoyed going to the center, seeing our programs in action, talking to the people who do the work with us, academic people, scientific people, people in the Ministry of Education, and people here who are related to our center through their similar interests. All of this has been very exciting for me, and I hope that the council will keep me busy for many years to come, and I don't expect it to stop.
Now, my hunch is they will keep you busy.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Weiner, you mentioned some of the people who have had instrumental roles with the council. Are there any others that...
Well, I think of a few who are not local people, but they're our co-workers, even though we may not know them personally. One who I have always respected and admired tremendously is not with us anymore is Mrs. Irving Engel, Catherine Engel, who was the president of the National Council some years back, who came into our work from, I think from Hias, because we had always done a program in overseas work with refugees and tracing families and so on, and who brought a great deal of knowledge and stimulation and just downright good sense to the Council of Jewish Women. I was impressed with some small things about her. I think small things tell you as much as big things about people. I remember going to a conference of the National Council of Federations and Welfare Funds in Atlantic City with my mother one year, when Judy Stang was the director of the women's divisions. It's a long time ago. Judy was a lovely woman. Catherine Engel was there, and she set up a little notice that all council members were invited to meet with her. She was then the national president, at her hotel in a certain room, and we went over there. And the first thing she did was personally move the chairs all around to make a circle for everybody. She knew everybody's name. See, I'm impressed with people that know everybody's name, because I don't know my own half the time. And she knew all about us, and she had a way of uplifting a woman and making her feel that she could do twice what she ever thought she could do before. And I think that is one of the qualities of leadership that I've seen in many people who are leaders. They have a way of bringing out the best that's in another person and opening up new doors that that person never thought of. That's one of Pauline Jackson's abilities, too, which I think is so very special and has been about her all these years. There were other wonderful women. Another one who is my good friend is Viola Hymes in Minneapolis, also a past national president of council, who is now on the staff of the Federation in Minneapolis. Another example of how we train people for things. She was a school teacher, has a very well-organized mind, thinks clearly, is not afraid to stick her neck out. You know, these are qualities that a young woman has to see displayed before her before she has the courage to make use of that quality in herself. I know I sat on the national board for several years and didn't open my mouth. I was completely awed. And we had then a treasurer. Her name was Leonard N from New York. A great, big, impressive woman who used to come to the meetings early with a copy of the Wall Street Journal and read it from cover to cover while she waited for the rest of us to settle in. And she was one who put up with no nonsense. The ladies would have wonderful ideas, and they'd say, we'll send a letter to the sections and it will be done. And she was the one that got up and said, you better send them out with the letter. And of course she was right. Well, after watching me sit there for about 3 years, she could feel the excitement mounting in me one day, I suppose, and she gave me a poke with her elbow, and she said, Joe, get up and give it to him. And I did, and I haven't stopped since, and I'm very grateful to her for giving me that courage. I think that's another quality of leadership, encouraging other people to say what they think. It isn't necessary to agree with people. I've always felt that leadership takes many forms, and the form I've had is usually being in the middle and trying to get both ends to come a little bit forward. And I appreciate both ends, because if they didn't both make a lot of noise, there'd be no movement at all. So they're important, and the people in the middle are important, And it takes all of them pushing together to even make one step forward. I've seen these qualities in these different women that I've worked with, and have tried to learn from them and appreciated very much not just the words, but the living example of what they meant.
Taught. Have there been any significant changes in the role that women have played in the Jewish community during the time that you've been active in community affairs?
Oh, I think so. I think that they are, as women generally, being looked at more and more as full partners and being expected to bear the responsibility as well as the privilege. And I'm glad that most of them seem to take the responsibility as well as the privilege. This is good because the world is made up of men and women, and to cut out half the population in any good cause is a mistake.
Has this been a gradual development? Or?
I think so. I think women have had to feel more assured about expressing themselves, and the men have had to feel less threatened. I remember doing a song once about "It's so nice to be a Federation dame, to keep discussions cool and coffee hot." Well, that's still all right, you know. And there's nothing wrong with serving the coffee, but you can do other things too. And I think the women are taking their place, generally speaking, in the community as full-fledged people. This means that they have to spend more time knowing what it's all about, considering issues, being serious about them. But most of them are willing to do that, and then they have a contribution to make. Of course, I'm a strong believer in the voluntary sector of our society, because I think without it we wouldn't have a free country. And I think that volunteers, not only as people who do direct service, but the volunteers who are interested in issues and who try to influence community climate and who make their wishes and their opinions known to the people who can change the laws or add to the laws. These are all important contributions that the volunteers make to freedom in this country. I think that the volunteer organizations which respond to human need cannot substitute for the government, which has to do major life-saving tasks. But without them, it would be a very long lag between the need and the doing. I think the volunteer organizations are at the grassroots level. They can make a personal response much faster than any government bureaucracy. And they can experiment, whereas the government can't afford to. And for all these reasons, I think the voluntary sector is terribly important to our country, and I'm all for making it strong and keeping it going.
Has there been a change in the role that volunteers played through the years that you've been involved in community?
Well, I think all of these aspects, which I've just mentioned, are becoming more and more important in the volunteers' role. Mm-hmm. Years ago, in the history of social work in this country, as I understand it, almost all social work was voluntary. And we're getting to the point now where it's a real teamwork between the volunteer and the professional, who represents continuity and specialized training. But the two together can really do the job that needs to be done in this country.
There are those who seriously question whether volunteerism is necessary and effective. In other words, you are not among those who
No, I
feel
certainly
this.
am not. I feel it's terribly important. I think that otherwise we would have a monolithic kind of country in which one's welfare was only of concern to the impersonal state, and the relationships between volunteers and clients are very important to keeping the heart of the community beating.
What do you see as the role of the volunteer in the future?
Well, I think there will be a great deal of this kind of advocacy as well as direct service. I think the volunteers will find, well, they are already, will find that they are all people who are professionals somewhere else. I mean, being a professional here doesn't mean you can't be a volunteer over there. And that the volunteer opportunities for trying new fields, for getting a wider vision, for making contacts with people you wouldn't ordinarily see are a tremendous payment to volunteers, which maybe they don't think about often enough.
they get a great many satisfactions and joys out of it, and more of this will be happening. I do think that it's important to use volunteers wisely, that they have to be placed where they can do something, and that the time and energy has to be put into training them. In service jobs, they can be staff members without pay. That's really what they ought to be. And they should have the same kind of responsible feeling toward their agency and in-service training and chances to grow that a staff member has. But this takes real understanding on the part of the staff and willingness to put in the time required.
Mrs. Weiner, I thank you very much for participating in this taping.
Well, it was a great pleasure, Mary. I enjoyed it, and I really feel highly honored to have been one of those selected.
Thank you.